The story of the American frontier is filled with hard men, fast guns, and tall tales. But every so often, a figure steps out of the haze of legend and demands a closer look. Today, we begin the life of one such man. His name was John Henry Holliday, but the world knew him simply as Doc. He left behind almost no letters, no diary, no confession of who he truly was. What remains are fragments, contradictions, glimpses, and the echoes of a man seen mostly through the eyes of others. A dentist, a gambler, a consumptive, a loyal friend, a deadly enemy, a Southerner forged in red clay and railroad smoke long before he ever set foot in Tombstone. To understand Doc Holliday, we must go back, before the gunfights, before the saloons, before the legend, back to Georgia, where the Old South collided with the raw frontier. Back to a childhood shaped by honor, illness, war, and a family whose fortunes rose and fell with the tides of American history. This is not the Hollywood Doc Holliday. This is the real man, complex, contradictory, and unforgettable. Welcome to Chronicles of the Old West. This is episode 1 in our series, Lungslinger, the Doc Holliday Odyssey.
It was 10 o'clock on the morning of November 8th, 1887, in Glenwood Springs, Colorado. A slight, frail man of 36 years lay dying in a modest room. His hair, once fair, had silvered prematurely. His body, once quick and deadly, was now bent and wasted by the merciless grip of chronic pulmonary tuberculosis. John Henry Holliday, Doc Holliday to history, drew his final rattling breath. He had not gone gently. In his last months, even as consumption hollowed him out, he displayed a fortitude and patience that won him friends among those who tended him. But the newspapers knew the legend. The Denver Republican captured the contradiction best. Doc Holliday is dead. Few men have been better known to a certain class of sporting people, and few men of his character had more friends or stronger companions. He represented a class of men who are disappearing in the New West. He had the reputation of being a bunco man, desperado, and bad man generally, yet he was a very mild-mannered man, was genial and companionable, and had many excellent qualities. Thus passed a man who would become one of the most enduring, enigmatic figures of the American frontier. A dentist, a gambler, a consumptive, a killer, Wyatt Earp's steadfast friend, a pale shadow who stole every scene in the blood-soaked drama of Tombstone. But who was he really? Some called him a Byronic aristocrat embittered by illness. Others saw the black sheep of a fine Southern family. To his enemies, he was a quarrelsome drunkard with a hair-triggered temper. To Wyatt Earp, through the words of his ghostwriter, he was a mad, merry scamp with heart of gold and nerves of steel, the quickest man with a six-shooter I ever knew. Bat Masterson was harsher, painting him as weak-bodied but dangerous when drinking, hot-headed and impetuous. Virgil Earp remembered him as gentlemanly, a good dentist, and friendly. A Las Vegas editor, safely distant, branded him a shiftless, bagged-legged character, a killer and a professional cutthroat. The contradictions pile up like spent cartridges. One newspaper man wrote that once Doc was your friend, he was always your friend. Once your enemy, always your enemy. Another observer noted his scrupulous neatness, his slumped shoulders from inherited disease, the clenched jaw and steady blue eyes that revealed the steel within. Yet Charles D. Reppy, partner at the Tombstone Epitaph, called him flatly the most thoroughly equipped liar and smoothest scoundrel in the United States. In these fragments we glimpse truth, but only glimpses. Doc Holliday left behind almost no personal writings, no intimate letters that might reveal his inner world. He gave few interviews, and those were laced with wry humor and disdain for the prying process. He remains a man seen almost entirely through the eyes of others, a compelling subject and a deeply frustrating one. This is the story of John Henry Holliday, not the myth forged in dime novels and Hollywood scripts, but the man shaped by the colliding forces of the Old South and the raw frontier. A life that embodies the moral contradictions of 19th century America itself. To understand Doc Holliday, we must first understand the world that made him. The Old South was never simply a place of white-columned plantations and magnolias in bloom. For many, especially in Georgia, it was a restless, expanding frontier, red clay and piney woods, Creek and Cherokee lands newly claimed by determined white settlers. Georgia was the youngest of the original 13 colonies. By the time John Henry was born, the nation had stretched to the Pacific, but his childhood unfolded in country still echoing with the removal of native nations. The Holliday family was part of that story, beneficiaries of tragedy and opportunity. John Henry's father, Henry Burroughs Holliday, was the very model of Andrew Jackson's common man. His people were plain folk, Scotch-Irish stock who had fought in the Revolution. Henry was born in 1819 in South Carolina, the first of 11 children. After his grandfather's death, the family moved into Georgia, settling near Fayetteville. Robert Alexander Holliday, Henry's father, opened a tavern and acquired an 800-acre farm carved from former Creek Nation land. Like so many white Georgians, Henry saw the Cherokee removal as both inevitable and righteous. In 1838, not yet 20, he enlisted as a second lieutenant in the 1st Georgia Volunteers. He took part in the grim work of rounding up Cherokee families, men, women, and children driven at gunpoint into stockades before the long, sorrowful march west on the Trail of Tears. It was duty he would later recall without apparent remorse. For his service, he received 160 acres in Pike County. The land was rich red clay, slowly cleared by the labor of white men and enslaved black men. Cotton became king, but Georgia's economy was diverse: corn, wheat, livestock, timber. Henry settled in the new town of Griffin, a railroad boomtown. He speculated in land, bought town lots, and built a reputation as a hard-nosed businessman with a quick temper but a sense of honor. In 1846, when war with Mexico erupted, Henry answered the call again. He rode with Fannon's Avengers out of Griffin, serving under Colonel Henry R. Jackson. They fought at Monterey, Veracruz, and Jalapa. Discharged in 1847, Henry returned with more than battle stories. He brought home an orphaned Mexican boy named Francisco Hidalgo, whom he took into his household. Back in Griffin, Henry set his sights on Alice Jane McKee, the refined 19-year-old daughter of a prominent family whose cotton plantation spoke of success. 10 years her senior, Henry had risen enough in local esteem to win her hand. They married on January 8, 1849, and moved into a house on Tinsley Street north of the railroad tracks. Alice Jane was everything the Southern ideal prized in a wife: genteel, pious, devoted to church and charity. She joined the Presbyterian Church to unite the family in faith. Henry, the self-made man, had married well. Their union promised stability, respectability, and the foundation for the family he craved. Their first child, Martha Eleonora, arrived on December 3, 1849. She was frail. On June 12, 1850, she died. The young couple grieved amid their extended families, Hollidays and McKees close by offering support. Then, on August 14, 1851, a son was born. They named him John Henry Holliday after his uncle Dr. John Stiles Holliday and his father. This child would become the center of their world, the eldest son, the primary heir, the guardian-to-be of the family name. Family lore, passed down through one source, claims John Henry was born with a cleft palate. Supposedly, his uncle, Dr. John Stiles Holliday, consulted the renowned Dr. Crawford W. Long, pioneer in ether anesthesia, who assisted in delicate surgery to close it. The story is tantalizing, an extraordinary medical event in 1851, but lacks contemporary corroboration. No records from Long mention it, despite his eagerness to document breakthroughs. Photographs of young John Henry show no obvious deformity. A posterior cleft might not have shown externally, but the weight of evidence suggests the tale may be more family legend than fact. Still, we must consider how early frailty or perceived difference might have shaped the boy, drawing him closer to his gentle mother, perhaps fostering a certain self-consciousness. Whatever the truth of his birth, John Henry was baptized on March 21, 1852, at the Griffin Presbyterian Church. By then, Henry Holliday had become the first clerk of the Superior Court for the newly created Spalding County. The family moved to a new home northwest of Griffin near the railroad tracks. The household grew fuller when Alice Jane's father died in 1856, leaving Henry guardian to her younger siblings, including 14-year-old Tom McKee, the older brother young John Henry would idolize. The boy grew up in a world of extended family, uncles, aunts, cousins, neighbors. His mother taught him the manners of the well-born, courtesy, faith, refinement. His father instilled the sterner virtues of Southern manhood, personal honor, discipline, readiness. Southern boys enjoyed remarkable freedom, roaming fields and woods, learning to hunt, ride, and handle firearms early. They were taught deference to elders, the sir and ma'am that marked respect, but also the fierce independence and pride that defined the culture. As historian W.J. Cash would later describe, this produced in Southerners a kindly courtesy, a level-eyed pride, an easy quietness, a barely perceptible flourish of bearing, even amid plainness. John Henry absorbed this world. From his father came a sense of honor and the willingness to defend it. From his mother, manners and moral grounding. The extended Holliday and McKee clans provided a web of support across Griffin, Fayetteville, and Jonesboro. The land itself was changing. Griffin prospered, population nearing 3,000 by the late 1850s, with colleges and a public library. Railroads brought commerce. Cotton fields stretched under the Georgia sun. Henry's holdings grew. Dozens of town lots, hundreds of acres, business interests. The family was rising. But storm clouds gathered on the national horizon. The Compromise of 1850 had papered over the slavery question, but tensions boiled. Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Each event deepened Southern fears that their way of life faced existential threat. Georgia's leaders prepared. Militia drilled. Weapons factories rose. In 1860, the nation fractured. Abraham Lincoln's election, without carrying Georgia, pushed the state toward secession. On January 19, 1861, Georgia declared itself independent. In February, Georgians helped draft the Confederate Constitution. By March, Georgia had joined the new Confederacy. John Henry Holliday's world, the secure, prosperous, honor-bound southern frontier childhood, stood on the brink of cataclysm. The boy who would become Doc was 8 years old when war came. The guns at Fort Sumter would soon echo across the South, and the Holliday family, like so many others, would be swept into the maelstrom. Doc Holliday did not spring fully formed from the dust of Tombstone or the gambling halls of Dodge City. He was forged in the red clay of Georgia, in the uneasy space between Southern gentility and frontier toughness, in a family that had profited from removal and expansion, and in a society that prized honor above almost all else. He was a child of cotton fields and railroad whistles, of extended kin and martial tradition, a boy who learned early the weight of family name and personal reputation, a son shaped by a father who had enforced the Trail of Tears and fought in Mexico, and a mother who embodied pious refinement. The tuberculosis that would eventually kill him may have already whispered in his blood. The contradictions that would define his legend, mild-mannered yet deadly, loyal friend and dangerous enemy, gambler and dentist, Southerner and wanderer, were planted in this soil. As the Confederacy marched to war, young John Henry stood at the threshold. The boyhood idyll was ending. Ahead lay loss, displacement, and the long road that would carry him westward, into saloons and gunsmoke, and into immortality. The air in Milledgeville crackled with electric fervor on that crisp January day in 1861. Senator Robert Toombs stood before a cheering crowd of Georgia recruits, his voice ringing like a battle cry. "Defend yourselves! The enemy is at your door!" The state was ablaze with the spirit of secession, a liberation from what many saw as the heavy hand of a distant central government. Georgians, planters and farmers, merchants and mechanics, embraced the cause with a fierce, almost religious zeal. They might not have grasped every nuance of sectional politics or agreed on the thorny question of slavery, but the mantra of Southern rights stirred their blood. They were confident, almost arrogantly so, in the righteousness and swiftness of their coming victory. When war finally erupted after Fort Sumter, Toombs, now the Confederacy's Secretary of State, boasted to fresh recruits that they would be home within 6 months. "Why," he proclaimed with a flourish, "we could lick the Yankees with corn stalks." It was the prevailing mood across Georgia, a righteous fight to protect home, honor, and liberty. Men from every walk of life answered the call, elegant planters in fine broadcloth, dandies with polished boots, humble clerks, middling farmers, and hard-scrabble crackers. Young and old, they marched to the colors with brash confidence forged in the ancestral memory of battles like Sterling and Bannockburn. Defeat was unthinkable. In the small town of Griffin, that excitement pulsed through the streets like a living thing. 10-year-old John Henry Holliday watched it all with wide eyes and a pounding heart. Troops moved in and out by road and rail, filling the town with the pomp of marching bands, the gleam of new Confederate gray uniforms, and the solemn weight of farewells. Camp Wilder became a bustling training ground, and the demand for more space led Henry Holliday, John Henry's father, to sell 136 acres of his 147-acre farm for another facility. Governor Joseph E. Brown himself wrote proudly of regiments training at Camp Stevens near Griffin. The war had arrived on the Holliday doorstep, and for an impressionable boy, it was the stuff of legends. John Henry idolized his 21-year-old Uncle Thomas Sylvester McKee as he donned the uniform of the 5th Georgia Volunteers. One by one, relatives followed. Uncles Robert Kennedy Holliday, John Stiles Holliday, James Taylor McKee, William Harrison McKee, and cousin Francisco Hidalgo. Even his cousin George Holliday, just 5 years older, prepared at the Georgia Military Institute in Marietta. There were tearful goodbyes, womenfolk clinging to their men, children waving from porches. Then they were gone, swallowed by the vast theater of war. Henry Holliday held out longest. He bought additional land, made what provisions he could, and on September 2nd, 1861, received his commission as a major in the 27th Georgia Infantry. By late October, he marched off to Virginia as quartermaster, arriving in time for the First Battle of Manassas. Alice Jane McKee Holliday, John Henry's mother, was left to manage the household, the farm, and the slaves alongside the other Southern women who bore their burdens with stoic grace. The initial thrill of mobilization soon gave way to anxious waiting. Letters arrived sporadically, carrying news of distant battles and the slow attrition of hope. John Henry, now the only male in a house full of women at the very age when Southern boys began their apprenticeship in manhood, found himself navigating a strangely feminine world amid the most masculine of enterprises. He learned the rudiments of hunting, fishing, wrestling, firearms, and horsemanship, honing them in the woods around Griffin. He imagined himself charging alongside his kin, holding back Yankee hordes. He lingered at the edges of Camp Stevens, stealing glimpses of drilling recruits and soaking up street corner gossip about the war. Only Dr. John Stiles Holliday, serving as medical officer with the 2nd Georgia Cavalry Home Guard, remained nearby to offer some masculine guidance. Family gatherings were rare, and John Henry grew especially close to and protective of his ailing mother. Alice Jane, a pious and gentle soul of the genteel Southern tradition, strove to raise him as a gentleman despite her worsening health. Tuberculosis, then called consumption, had taken hold. It was the era's great killer, romanticized in literature as a spiritual affliction that ennobled its victims. Alice Jane bore her suffering with Christian fortitude, maintaining her household duties as best she could, her calm demeanor a model of Southern womanhood. Yet as her strength faded, the burden shifted to female relatives, and young John Henry stepped up as the man of the house. News from the front was rarely encouraging. Uncle William McKee was wounded at Malvern Hill, furloughed, and later elected captain. Major Holliday endured the brutal Peninsular Campaign, witnessing the 27th Georgia suffer devastating casualties at places like Williamsburg, Seven Pines, and Malvern Hill. By July 1862, Henry himself was felled by chronic diarrhea and disability, resigning his commission and returning home in August. He found a changed world. Goods scarce, crops thin, his wife nearly bedridden. Then, in November, his father Robert died, forcing Henry to shoulder estate duties as the eldest son. The tide of war turned decisively in 1863. Union victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg opened the doorway to Georgia. After Chickamauga and the fall of Missionary Ridge, Major Holliday recognized the peril. Atlanta would be the target. He sold property in Spalding County, raising Confederate currency, and moved his invalid wife, young son, and sisters-in-law to the remote safety of Valdosta in southern Georgia, a safe retreat deep in the piney woods and wiregrass, far from the railroads and advancing armies. Valdosta in 1864 was a raw, half-finished settlement, struggling against the blockade and poor crops. Churches had blown down. Buildings stood unfinished. Refugees crowded the single hotel. Henry purchased 2,450 acres on Cat Creek for $31,500, seeking stability amid chaos. The family's journey, by rail through Macon, Savannah, and finally the Atlantic and Gulf Line, was arduous. They arrived in a wilderness of open pine forests, lime sinks, cypress swamps, and black loam promising for cotton. Locals, free grazers, and small farmers eyed them warily, but made room. Life in Valdosta was a world apart from the familiar red clay hills and settled farmlands of Griffin. Here, in the deep piney woods and wiregrass country of southern Georgia, the landscape unfolded like a vast, open parkland. Endless stands of long-leaf pine and oak stretching across rolling terrain, with little undergrowth beneath the canopy. Farther south lay lime sinks, cypress swamps, and black, fertile loam ideal for cotton. It felt both hauntingly beautiful and profoundly empty, a wilderness compared to the bustling streets and cultivated fields John Henry had known. Now entering adolescence, the boy roamed these open woods, hunted, worked the family's new land on Cat Creek, and attended makeshift schools held in the courthouse or the renovated Valdosta Institute. War news reached them slowly, filtered through rumor and unreliable letters. Sherman's merciless advance through northern Georgia, the brutal fighting at Kennesaw Mountain, the fall of Atlanta in September 1864, and the fiery destruction that followed as Hood's Confederate forces evacuated the city. Each report carried fresh anxiety for relatives still caught in the path of the Union Army. Then came the dramatic arrival of family. Mary Ann, Molly Holliday, wife of John Henry's Uncle Robert, and her children had been caught in the chaos of the Battle of Jonesboro. After burying the dead in her own backyard and watching her home destroyed, Molly fled south with her young ones. One day early in October 1864, Major Henry Holliday was tying his horse near the Valdosta train station when he looked up and saw them standing on the platform. They had traveled for weeks in crowded boxcars with no way to send word ahead. It was a miraculous chance reunion. Henry immediately gave them a house on his farm. Cousins Maddie and Lucy soon joined the household, arriving in time for a somber but grateful Christmas. At 16, Maddie was blossoming into the very picture of Southern womanhood, charming, graceful, and poised. John Henry, 19 months her junior and just beginning to feel the stirrings of puberty, found himself drawn to her in new and powerful ways. In the midst of wartime hardship, family displacement, and his mother's declining health, Maddie became a welcome distraction, a bright spark of warmth, flirtation, and youthful mystery in an otherwise uncertain world. Work was constant in Major Holliday's household. There were no slackers. Alice Jane's condition worsened. Sherman's march to the sea isolated Valdosta further when rails were destroyed, but southern Georgia was largely spared direct occupation. The war ground to its bitter end in 1865. Miraculously, all the Holliday and McKee men returned, wounded, hardened, but alive. Tom McKee, hospitalized and serving as wardmaster, was fetched home by a bold young John Henry, according to family lore. The reunions at Cat Creek were joyful, yet the hard times ahead loomed large. Valdosta escaped immediate federal occupation, but Reconstruction soon arrived. In summer 1865, troops moved into the Lowndes County Courthouse. The Freedmen's Bureau agent, Captain C.C. Richardson, and later units of the 103rd U.S. Colored Infantry brought friction. Black soldiers empowered to advocate for freedmen clashed with white attitudes. Arrests on flimsy charges, intimidation, and resentment over black authority fueled tensions. A young ex-Confederate, Richard Force, became a local martyr after being shot during a confrontation, dying of blood poisoning in May 1866. His death symbolized resistance for the town's youth, including the restless John Henry, who absorbed the communal contempt for the occupation even from the relative isolation of Cat Creek. School provided structure. Professors Newton and Mathis, followed by the legendary Samuel McWeir Varnado in late 1865, offered rigorous education amid scarcity. Varnado instilled discipline, pride, and achievement. John Henry, already well-mannered and charming from his mother's influence and large family, excelled in the classroom and social arena. He was popular with girls, cocky among peers, strong-minded and aggressive when provoked. On May 30th, 1866, just 2 weeks after Dick Force was laid to rest, Major Henry Holliday made a decision that would shatter what little peace remained in the family. He accepted an appointment as an agent for the Freedmen's Bureau, the federal agency established to assist newly freed slaves. To his neighbors in Valdosta, this was nothing short of betrayal. They branded him a scalawag, a contemptuous label reserved for Southern whites who cooperated with Reconstruction authorities. Whispers of treachery spread through the town. Henry Holliday, once a respected Confederate major, was now denounced as a worthless collaborator, a deceitful turncoat who had sided with the enemy. The appointment drove a deeper wedge between father and son. John Henry, already simmering with resentment over the occupation, the death of Dick Force, and the changes sweeping the South, felt personally humiliated. His own father, his flesh and blood, had aligned himself with the very forces the community viewed as oppressors. Then, scarcely 4 months later, on September 16, 1866, came a blow that would wound John Henry far more profoundly. Alice Jane McKee Holliday died at home after years of cruel suffering from what doctors called consumption. She had been confined to her bed for a long time, yet those who knew her spoke of her remarkable spirit. Reverend Ousley, the local Methodist minister, delivered a moving tribute that captured the essence of her character. He described her as a cheerful Christian who bore unimaginable affliction with quiet fortitude and grace. Even in her final days, she remained deeply solicitous about the welfare of her loved ones, especially her only son. Anxious for his spiritual future, she had deliberately changed her church affiliation from Presbyterian to the Methodist Episcopal Church. She could not, in good conscience, leave her boy with a creed she did not fully accept in her heart. Her faith, her example, and her prayers, she believed, would continue to guide him even after she was gone. Her passing left a vast and aching void in the Holliday household. To John Henry, not yet 15, Alice Jane had been far more than a mother. She had been his anchor, his moral compass, and the one steady source of love and restraint in a world turned upside down by war and loss. With her death, the last gentle break on his rebellious nature was gone. He mourned her deeply and in silence, the grief carving itself into his young soul at the very moment when he needed her guidance most. 3 months later, Major Holliday married 23-year-old Rachel Martin, a neighbor's daughter. The swift union, performed by the same Reverend Ousley, scandalized the town and shattered family relations. John Henry, furious at the perceived disrespect to his mother's memory, resented his young stepmother. The family moved into town, further straining the father-son bond. With Alice Jane's gentle but firm influence gone forever, and the fresh wound of his father's scandalous remarriage still raw, John Henry's rebellious streak burst into the open. The restraints that had once held him in check had vanished, and the wilder currents of adolescence rushed in. In the post-war South, boys of his class and age were expected to test the boundaries of manhood. Honor was not something inherited. It had to be proven. Young Southern gentlemen proved it through fighting, gambling, swearing, drinking, and wenching. These exploits, while frowned upon in excess, were quietly understood as part of forging a man's character among his peers. John Henry embraced this code with characteristic intensity. One incident at school would be remembered for years. What began as an ordinary schoolyard quarrel escalated when his opponent, seeking to settle the matter like gentlemen, challenged John Henry to a formal duel with pistols. John Henry accepted without hesitation. The two boys, accompanied by their seconds, met on the edge of town at the appointed time. 2 pistols were laid out before them. When offered his choice of weapons, John Henry coolly replied that he had brought his own pistol and that it was already loaded with balls, not mere powder. The words landed like a thunderclap. The seconds and his opponent were stunned into silence. They had intended a mock duel, the kind common among hot-blooded boys, pistols charged only with powder to make noise and smoke, but cause no real harm. Here stood 14-year-old John Henry Holliday, calm and deadly serious, ready to shed blood over a childish slight. They pleaded with him to use one of the blank-loaded pistols. He refused. This was his gun, and he would use it. Only then did the others hurriedly explain that the entire affair had been meant as a joke, a bit of theater to satisfy honor without real danger. John Henry eased the weapon down, certain now the laugh wasn't at his expense. An amicable settlement was reached, and the duel ended without bloodshed. But the story spread through Valdosta like wildfire. Beneath the charming, well-mannered exterior shaped by his mother's careful upbringing, there burned a nervy, aggressive spirit, bold, unflinching, and utterly unafraid of consequences. It was the first clear glimpse of the dangerous edge that would one day make John Henry Holliday a legend of the Old West. The family rifts that opened after Alice Jane's death only grew wider and more bitter in the months that followed. Alice Jane's brothers and sisters, particularly the McKees, were outraged by what they saw as Henry Holliday's disrespect for their sister. Barely 3 months after her burial, his swift remarriage had already poisoned relations. Now they took their grievances to court. Tom McKee and the family filed suit against Major Holliday to recover property that rightfully belonged to Alice Jane's estate, property that would otherwise have passed to him as the widowed husband. Among the holdings was the valuable iron front building in downtown Griffin. In a Solomonic compromise, the Lowndes County judge ordered the building physically divided. A partition was erected straight down the center, awarding one half to the McKees and the other to Henry Holliday as guardian for his son, John Henry. The literal splitting of the family property stood as a stark symbol of the emotional fracture that could not so easily be mended. Major Holliday's continued role as a Freedmen's Bureau agent only poured fuel on the fire. To many in Valdosta and across the South, he had become the very definition of a scalawag, a Southern white man who had thrown in with the Yankee occupiers and their Reconstruction policies. Public scorn intensified. He was openly denounced in the streets and in private conversations as a turncoat and collaborator. For John Henry, the shame of his father's reputation was a constant, humiliating burden. Tensions across Georgia reached a new boiling point in the spring of 1868. On April 4th, Republican congressional candidate J.W. Clift arrived in Valdosta to deliver a campaign speech at the courthouse. A large crowd gathered, mostly freedmen, along with curious locals. In the middle of Clift's address, a sudden explosion rocked the building. No one was injured, but panic scattered the audience. Local authorities quickly determined that a group of young white men had placed a small keg containing a modest charge of powder beneath the courthouse, a deliberate prank meant to frighten the speaker and disrupt the rally rather than cause real harm. While community leaders, including Henry Holliday himself, publicly condemned the incident, the young men involved became local heroes in the eyes of many resentful whites. Among those whispered to have taken part, though never definitively proven, was John Henry Holliday. The episode fit his emerging reputation for boldness and defiance. Arrests followed. 5 young men from prominent families were taken from their beds in chains by federal soldiers and hauled off toward Savannah for trial by military commission. The town erupted in fury. The charges eventually faded amid the political chaos, and the young men returned home to triumphant welcomes. But the entire affair left John Henry simmering with the same rebellious energy that had already marked him. Seeking some distance from the powder keg atmosphere in Valdosta, he spent much of that turbulent summer of 1868 with relatives in Jonesboro. There, under the roof of his uncle Robert Kennedy Holliday, he lived once again in close quarters with his cousin Mattie. Now 18 and in full bloom as a charming Southern belle, Mattie was more captivating than ever. For John Henry, it was a summer of discontent laced with youthful longing, moments of flirtation and closeness amid Georgia's stormy readmission to the Union and the final, painful adjustments of Reconstruction. Education continued under Varnado. In 1869, John Henry worked at the Atlantic and Gulf Railroad Station. A pivotal connection arrived, Dr. Lucian E. Frink, a young ex-Confederate dentist who had trained in Philadelphia. Under Frink's guidance, John Henry decided on dental school. In September 1870, he arrived at the prestigious Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery in Philadelphia. The city was a revelation, vast, bustling, northern. Far from southern constraints, the cocky Georgian navigated a rigorous curriculum: chemistry, anatomy, operative and mechanical dentistry, surgery, and endless clinical practice. He applied himself with gifted focus, yet found time to taste urban life, saloons, perhaps gambling dens, learning about Yankees beyond the battlefield. By spring 1871, he returned to Valdosta to apprentice with Frink. He completed his second year, thesis on diseases of the teeth, and prepared for graduation. Delayed by age requirements, he turned 21 in August 1872. John Henry gained practical experience first in St. Louis with classmate A. Jameson Fuchs. The frontier city, raw and bawdy, suited his restless spirit. Near Dr. Fuchs's dental office stood a lively theater and saloon, one of those bustling frontier establishments where entertainment, drink, and vice mingled freely under the gaslights. It was there that he first encountered a striking young woman who called herself Kate Fisher. Her real name was Mary Catherine Harrony. Born on November 7, 1850, in Pest, Hungary, she had immigrated to America with her family around 1860. They settled in Davenport, Iowa, among a small Hungarian community. Tragedy struck early. By 1866, both her parents were dead. Left under guardianship, the teenage Kate soon rebelled. She ran away. Some stories say she stowed away on a riverboat and adopted the boat captain's surname, Fisher. Others suggest she took the name from a famous actress of the day, Kate Fisher, known for her scandalous stage performances in Mazeppa, riding across the stage in little more than pink tights. By 1870, Kate was living in St. Louis. The census listed her among a group of women working as prostitutes. By the time John Henry arrived in 1872, she was employed at the theater saloon near Fouché's office, a world away from the genteel Southern society he had known. Their meeting ignited something immediate and intense. What began as a chance encounter blossomed into a passionate, turbulent connection that would shadow much of John Henry's life. Kate later claimed they were married. Others described it as a fiery affair between a restless young dentist and a beautiful, worldly woman of the demi-monde. Whatever the exact nature of their bond, it was complicated, deeply personal, and far from fleeting. Kate would remember John Henry Holliday long after he left St. Louis, and he in turn would never fully forget her. That summer of 1872, John Henry returned to Georgia and settled into the bustling household of his uncle, Dr. John Stiles Holliday, in the rapidly recovering city of Atlanta. The war had left its scars on the young capital, but Atlanta was rebuilding with fierce determination. New businesses, new faces, and a sense of boundless possibility in the New South. Dr. Holliday had shrewdly transitioned from medicine into a thriving grocery partnership with R.W. Tidwell, another Fayetteville transplant. The enterprise had prospered, allowing him to step away from regular medical practice. For John Henry, moving into his uncle's comfortable home meant not only family support, but immediate access to Atlanta's professional and social circles. It was through these connections that he was introduced to Dr. Arthur C. Ford, one of the most respected dentists in the state. Ford, an Englishman who had come to Georgia by way of South Africa, carried his own dramatic past. He had fought for the Confederacy, been wounded at Sharpsburg, and built a sterling reputation after the war. When Ford's partner, Dr. Albert Haight, dissolved their practice and moved to Tombstone, Ford needed a reliable replacement while he attended the Southern Dental Association meeting in Richmond, Virginia. On July 26, 1872, the Atlanta Constitution carried a formal notice. I hereby inform my patients that I leave to attend the sessions of the Southern Dental Association in Richmond, Virginia this evening, and will be absent until about the middle of August, during which time Dr. J. H. Holliday will fill my place in my office. For the ambitious young dentist, this was a golden opportunity. Filling the chair of such a prominent practitioner gave John Henry instant credibility and valuable connections in Atlanta's growing professional community. He threw himself into the work with skill and charm, quickly proving himself worthy of the trust. On August 14, 1872, the very day Dr. Ford returned to Atlanta, John Henry turned 21. That same day, he came fully of age. His father formally transferred the property he had held in guardianship, and his uncle presented him with a handsome gift, a model 1851 Navy Colt revolver, the same model he had given to his own 3 sons. The pistol was more than a weapon. It was a powerful symbol of manhood and independence in the post-war South. Well-bred, formally educated, professionally credentialed, and now legally independent, Dr. John Henry Holliday stood at the threshold of a promising future in the New South. Yet beneath the polished surface of the young Southern gentleman burned a restless fire, kindled in the war-torn hills of Georgia, stoked by personal loss, family strife, and the defiant spirit that had already revealed itself in schoolyard duels and Reconstruction-era pranks. That fire would not be content with a quiet life in Atlanta. Soon it would pull him westward into the saloons, gambling halls, and gun smoke of the legendary Old West.
Doc Holliday's beginnings weren't forged in gunsmoke or saloon light. They were shaped in the quiet rooms of Southern homes, in the red clay of Georgia, and in the shadows of a nation tearing itself apart. Before he ever stepped into Tombstone, before his name was whispered with awe or fear, he was simply John Henry, a boy watching his world fracture, a son carrying grief, honor, and a restless fire that would never quite be tamed. In this first chapter, we've traced the forces that molded him. The frontier childhood steeped in Southern codes of honor, the Trail of Tears legacy that hung over his family, the Civil War that swept away his innocence, the death of the mother who anchored him, the bitter rift with his father, and the early flashes of a temper and courage that hinted at the man he would become. These weren't the deeds of a legend yet, but they were the fault lines that would shape one. At Chronicles of the Old West, we follow these stories back to their roots. Court records, family histories, frontier newspapers, and the fading recollections of those who lived them. So, the past doesn't just inform us, it stays alive in the telling. If this episode brought Doc Holliday's early world into focus, sharing it through a rating, a review, or a word to someone who still believes history should be felt, not merely studied, helps keep these stories breathing. And this journey is only beginning. Ahead lie the losses that will drive him west, the illness that will shadow his every step, the friendships that will define his loyalty, and the choices that will carve his name into frontier legend. Join us next time for Episode 2 of Lungslinger, the Doc Holliday Odyssey, only on Chronicles of the Old West.